October 24, 1944. Leyte Gulf, Philippines. The after-action report filed by Captain Hideaki Nakamura would describe what happened that morning in careful, military language. Enemy armor advanced with unusual coordination, but no official document could capture the dread he felt watching 5 American Sherman tanks emerge from the jungle tree line, separated by dense vegetation with no possible line of sight between them, yet moving with a precision that seemed to violate the laws of warfare itself. Through the smoke and humidity of the Philippine jungle, the Shermans fanned out like the fingers of a closing hand. No flag signals, no visible runners between vehicles, no hand gestures from open hatches. Yet each tank turned at precisely the right moment, their turrets swiveling to cover angles. Captain Nakamura's crew couldn't even identify as vulnerable until it was too late. Inside his Type 97 Chiha, Nakamura pressed his radio headset tighter against his ear, hearing only the hiss and crackle that plagued Japanese tank radios. He shouted across the 50 meters, separating his tank from his lieutenant's vehicle. No response came back through the jungle noise and artillery thunder. His signalman waved a flag frantically. By the time the message reached the second tank in line, the Americans had already repositioned. The Japanese tanks operated the way they'd been trained, through discipline, visual coordination, and the unbreakable chain of command. Each crew waited for orders from vehicles they could see, transmitted through signals they could interpret. The Americans were fighting a different war entirely. Before we continue, click that subscribe button, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now let's get back to the story. Their radio chatter, intercepted by Japanese signals units but incomprehensible in its clarity and casualness, revealed men discussing firing solutions, coordinating movements, and calling for artillery support as if they were sitting in the same room. The transmissions cut through engine noise and battlefield chaos with impossible precision. 25-watt signals where Japanese systems struggled with 10. Frequency modulation where Japanese doctrine relied on amplitude modulation that picked up every spark, every electrical interference, every dying radio tube as overwhelming static. Across 8,000 miles from Detroit's factories, the most underestimated technological advantage of the Pacific War was announcing itself. Not in the thickness of Sherman armor, which Japanese Type 97 guns could penetrate at close range. Not in firepower, where Japanese tank doctrine emphasized close-quarters combat and individual courage. But in the invisible electromagnetic spectrum that connected every American tank crew in ways the Imperial Japanese Army had never imagined necessary. The revolution began on July 22, 1941, when the United States Army Signal Corps standardized 3 radio sets for all medium tanks, the SCR-508, SCR-528, and SCR-538. While Japanese tank designers focused on improving armor angles and gun calibers, American engineers at the Galvin Manufacturing Company, soon to be renamed Motorola, were perfecting a technology that would render traditional tank tactics obsolete. The engineering team was led by Daniel E. Noble, who recognized that Edwin Armstrong's frequency modulation patents could transform military communications, and Henryk Magnuski, the Polish-born RF engineer who solved the brutal technical challenge of installing precision electronics inside a vehicle designed to absorb artillery impacts. Their creation, a 180-pound radio system that transformed every Sherman tank from an isolated war machine into a node in the world's first true battlefield network. The BC-604 FM transmitter generated 25 watts of clear, interference-resistant power, 2.5 times the output of comparable Japanese systems. operating in the 20.0 to 27.9 MHz frequency range. It provided 10 preset crystal-controlled channels that could be changed with the flip of a switch. The dual BC-603 receivers allowed American tank commanders to monitor multiple frequencies simultaneously, one for platoon coordination, another for company-level orders, enabling a flexibility Japanese doctrine couldn't accommodate. But the true revolution lay in frequency modulation itself. Edwin Armstrong's FM technology, licensed to the U.S. military, eliminated the static and interference that plagued amplitude modulation. While Japanese tank radios, operating on AM in the 4.0 to 5.0 MHz range, picked up every electrical discharge, every engine spark, every lightning strike as deafening noise. American FM radios delivered voice communication clear enough to recognize individual speakers even during artillery barrages. October 20, 1944. As General Douglas MacArthur's forces returned to the Philippines, American armor landed on Leyte with SCR-508 radios that would soon shatter Japanese assumptions about tank warfare. The Imperial Japanese Army's tank forces, despite being veterans of campaigns in China and Southeast Asia, operated under communication constraints that seemed normal until they faced an enemy who didn't share them. A standard Japanese tank platoon of 5 vehicles typically included only 1 or 2 tanks with full radio transceivers. The remaining vehicles carried receivers only, if they had radios at all. They could hear orders but couldn't respond, couldn't report enemy positions, couldn't call for help. Japanese tank platoons functioned through rigid hierarchy and visible command. The platoon leader transmitted orders that subordinate tanks acknowledged through actions and flag signals rather than words. When command tanks were disabled, easily identified by their distinctive long-wire antennas, entire platoons lost coordination. The Americans had no such vulnerability. Every Sherman could transmit. Every crew could take initiative. Every tank commander could call for fire support, coordinate with infantry, or assume command functions if senior vehicles were destroyed. The fighting around Breakneck Ridge and the Ormoc Valley, October through December 1944, provided the first sustained demonstration of what this technological gap meant in combat. During the chaotic fighting in Triple Canopy Jungle, scattered elements of the 1st Cavalry Division and 7th Infantry Division's attached tank battalions maintained coordination across terrain where visual signals were impossible. Sherman crews who had never met face-to-face coordinated flanking attacks warned each other of Japanese infantry infiltration teams and directed devastating artillery fire through crystal-clear FM communications. Japanese signals intelligence units, monitoring American frequencies from positions they assumed were safely distant, noted the exceptional clarity and informal tone of U.S. transmissions. The 14th Area Army's Communications Section reported that American armored units maintained contact at ranges of 15 to 20 kilometers, distances where Japanese Type 94 and Type 96 radios produced only static or went silent entirely. More disturbing was the realization that American tank crews seemed to operate without the command hierarchy Japanese doctrine considered essential. Subordinate tanks gave suggestions. Privates reported tactical information directly. The rigid chain of command that defined Japanese military culture appeared absent. Yet American formations moved with a coordination that suggested perfect discipline. What Japanese observers were witnessing was distributed command, a concept their doctrine had no framework to understand. Every Sherman crew was empowered to communicate, to think, to adapt. The radio wasn't just a tool for transmitting orders downward. It was a network that allowed information to flow in every direction simultaneously. January 1945 brought American armor to Luzon, where the mountainous approaches to Manila should have negated any radio advantage. Instead, FM technology proved even more valuable in conditions that rendered Japanese AM radios completely useless. The SCR-508's frequency modulation handled the multipath interference of mountain valleys, where radio waves bounce and scatter off terrain, far better than amplitude modulation. American tank units coordinated movements through the Zambales Mountains and the approaches to Baguio with precision that Japanese doctrine said required direct visual contact. During the fighting near Balete Pass, American armored units demonstrated capabilities that seemed supernatural to Japanese defenders. Tank platoons separated by ridge lines and dense forest coordinated attacks with timing, suggesting they could see through mountains. The Sixth Army's after-action reports described routine coordination at distances where Japanese Type 96 radios, standard equipment for tank units, produced only atmospheric hiss. Japanese tank crews began reporting a new psychological burden: the silence. While American radio chatter filled their frequency spectrum with calm, professional communication, Japanese tankers heard only static, broken by occasional garbled orders they couldn't quite make out. The Americans seemed to be everywhere, always talking, always coordinating. The Japanese felt isolated even when surrounded by their own forces. After the fall of Manila, captured Japanese intelligence documents revealed the depth of their misunderstanding. A signals analysis report from the 10th Independent Tank Brigade noted, American tank formations maintain communication discipline superior to expectations, but display unusual informality in transmission procedures. Subordinate units provide tactical intelligence without prompting. Command vehicles do not appear to dominate communications as doctrine would suggest. Range and clarity of transmissions exceeds Japanese capabilities by estimated factor of 3 to 5. The report concluded with a recommendation that would never be implemented. Future tank development must prioritize communication systems with capability matching American standards. Current doctrine, assuming visual coordination insufficient against enemy employing distributed network communications. The analysis was dated February 3, 1945. By then, organized Japanese tank resistance in the Philippines had effectively ceased. The gap wasn't merely technical. It was industrial and philosophical. Japanese radio manufacturers like Nippon Electric Company and Tokyo Shibawara Electric, later Toshiba, produced quality equipment by 1930s standards. But they lacked access to Edwin Armstrong's FM patents, had limited supplies of the precision crystals needed for frequency control, and operated within a military doctrine that saw radios as tools for transmitting orders rather than enabling communication. American industry, by contrast, had transformed radio manufacturing into a mass-production science. By 1944, Motorola alone was producing 50,000 military radio sets per month. The SCR-508, SCR-528, and SCR-538 systems were being installed not just in tanks but in half-tracks, armored cars, and command vehicles, creating an integrated battlefield network that Japanese forces couldn't replicate or counter. The Japanese Army's attempts to jam American frequencies proved futile. FM's resistance to interference meant that even when Japanese signals units identified American channels and transmitted static, U.S. tank crews barely noticed the disruption. March 1945. British and American forces driving through Burma toward Rangoon faced Japanese armor equipped with the same inadequate radios that had failed in the Philippines. The results were identical. During the fighting around Maiktila and Mandalay, Allied tank formations, now including British units equipped with American-supplied SCR radios, demonstrated coordination across sprawling battlefields that left Japanese commanders struggling to understand how scattered enemy forces could respond to threats with such speed. A captured Japanese officer from the 2nd Tank Division, interrogated after the fall of Maiktila, described the experience. We could not understand how British and American tanks, separated by kilometers, knew to converge on our positions simultaneously. We assumed aircraft spotting, but attacks continued at night and in weather when aircraft could not fly. Only after capture did we learn every enemy tank possessed radio capability we believed reserved for command vehicles. By the time Japan's surrender was formalized on September 2, 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army had begun a comprehensive study of captured American equipment. The reports on the SCR-508 radio system were marked with phrases like revolutionary, unforeseen advantage, and doctrine-changing technology. Post-war analysis by Japanese military historians would identify tank radio communications as one of the key technological gaps that made Japanese armored forces obsolete before they even engaged American tanks in sustained combat. The courage, training, and tactical skill of Japanese tank crews, proven in China and Southeast Asia, couldn't overcome an enemy that fought as a coordinated network rather than individual vehicles. The post-war Japan self-defense forces would learn this lesson well. When the JGSDF established its armored forces in the 1950s, every single tank, from the Type 61 medium tank onward, came equipped with FM radio transceivers as standard equipment. The doctrine emphasized distributed communications, flexible command structures, and network-centric coordination. The shock of discovery had become the foundation of transformation. What Captain Nakamura witnessed in the jungles of Leyte, what countless Japanese tank crews experienced from the Philippines to Burma, was more than technological surprise. It was the revelation that modern warfare had fundamentally changed. The Japanese fought with the courage and discipline of warriors trained in tradition. The Americans fought with the cold efficiency of engineers who understood that information dominates battlefields more decisively than armor or guns. In the humid jungles of the Pacific, in the mountain passes of Luzon, across the plains of Burma, the same scene repeated. Japanese tanks calling out to each other through flags and shouts, while American Shermans spoke in clear, calm voices across miles of chaos. Silence met speech. Isolation met network. And the outcome was never in doubt. The SCR-508 radio weighed 180 pounds, cost approximately $1,500 to produce, and looked like an ordinary green metal box to anyone who didn't understand its significance. It was, quietly and without ceremony, one of the most decisive weapons of World War II. But the story of how every American tank came to carry this revolutionary technology didn't begin on the battlefields of the Pacific. It began in the research laboratories and corporate boardrooms of 1930s America, where engineers and military planners were asking a question the Japanese never thought to consider. What if the real weapon wasn't the tank itself, but the invisible network connecting them all? Lieutenant Takeshi Yamamoto crouched inside his Type 97 Chiha, sweat dripping into his eyes despite the early morning chill. The jungle around Ormoc Valley should have provided concealment. Thick vegetation, broken terrain, the kind of environment where Japanese forces had proven their superiority throughout China and Malaya. Instead, the foliage felt like a shroud closing in. He pressed the radio headset harder against his ear, as if physical pressure could somehow force clarity through the static. Nothing. Just the endless hiss and crackle that had plagued his communications since the Americans landed 3 weeks ago. "Sergeant Ito!" he shouted through his open hatch, trying to reach the Type 97 positioned 50 meters to his left. The engine noise and distant artillery made even shouting futile. His signalman scrambled to wave colored flags according to the manual, the standard method that had worked perfectly well until now. Then the jungle erupted. 5 Sherman tanks materialized through the morning mist like iron ghosts. What happened next would haunt Yamamoto for the rest of his life, not because of the violence, but because of the impossibility. The Shermans couldn't see each other. The vegetation was too dense, the spacing too wide, the terrain too broken. Yet they moved as if connected by invisible threads. The lead tank pivoted left, while simultaneously, without any visible signal, the second tank swung right. The third held position, providing overwatch, while the fourth and fifth maneuvered to flank positions that Yamamoto's own tactical training told him were the correct choices. If those crews could somehow see through solid jungle. How? Yamamoto grabbed for his radio again, desperate to warn his company commander. Static roared in his ears like ocean waves. His signalman waved flags frantically toward Lieutenant Sato's tank, positioned somewhere in the green chaos behind them. By the time visual signals crossed the distance, by the time Sato's crew interpreted them and responded, by the time those responses made their way back, the Americans had already repositioned again. The Japanese doctrine was elegant: rigid hierarchy, visual coordination, disciplined execution. Each tank waited for clear orders from vehicles within line of sight. Each commander maintained control through signals his subordinates could interpret. It had worked brilliantly against Chinese forces who fought with even less coordination. But the Americans were playing a different game entirely. Yamamoto's radio suddenly crackled to life, not with Japanese voices, but with intercepted American transmissions. Through the static, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Calm, almost casual English. Men discussing firing solutions like they were ordering breakfast. Coordinates exchanged with precision. Warnings about Japanese positions given and acknowledged without urgency. They were talking to each other, not shouting orders, not transmitting formal commands, just talking. As if the 5 separate steel machines were actually one organism with 5 sets of eyes. "They cannot see through jungle," Yamamoto whispered to himself, watching another Sherman execute a perfect flanking movement at the exact moment it became tactically necessary. They cannot, but they could hear each other. And in that moment, Lieutenant Yamamoto understood that his Type 97, with its brave crew and adequate armor and proven tactics, was already obsolete. The Americans weren't just fighting with tanks. They were fighting with something his doctrine had no answer for. They were fighting as a network. February 12, 1945. Manila Technical Arsenal. Major Hiroshi Tanaka had examined captured enemy equipment throughout his career. Chinese rifles, British artillery pieces, even a Russian tank once. Nothing had prepared him for what sat before him now, carefully extracted from a disabled Sherman near the Pasig River. The SCR-508 radio set looked deceptively ordinary. A green metal box, roughly 2 feet wide, covered in dials and switches with English labels his translator was still deciphering. Weight: approximately 82 kilograms according to their scales. It had taken 4 men to carry it from the tank's interior to this makeshift laboratory. This, Captain Nakagawa, the signals officer, sounded skeptical. This is what gave them such coordination? Major Tanaka didn't answer immediately. He was reading the technical specifications. His engineering team had compiled over 3 days of careful examination, and each line made his stomach tighten with a mixture of professional admiration and strategic dread. Transmission power, 25 watts. Their own Type 96 radios struggled with 10 watts on the best days. Most Japanese tank radios operated at 5 watts or less, considered adequate for company-level command vehicles. Operating frequency, 20.0 to 27.9 MHz. 10 preset channels. Crystal-controlled tuning. Crystal control meant stability. No drift. No manual adjustments needed during combat. The Americans could preset their frequencies and know every tank in the formation would remain perfectly synchronized. But it was the next specification that changed everything. Modulation type, frequency modulation, FM. Impossible, Lieutenant Yoshida, their radio specialist, had said when he first identified it. FM technology for military vehicles. The patents alone, the manufacturing precision required, Major Tanaka had ordered him to verify 3 times. The result was always the same. He picked up the report from their field tests. They'd powered the American radio using a captured generator, broadcast on its preset frequencies, and listened to the clarity with their own receiving equipment. The quality of transmission had left his entire technical staff silent. No static from electrical interference. No fade-out from spark plugs firing. No distortion from engine noise or track movement. The American voices, recorded during battle from their signals intelligence units, came through with telephone clarity even when tanks were moving at full speed across broken terrain. "Every Sherman carries this?" Nakagawa asked quietly. According to interrogation reports from captured American crews, yes. Every medium tank, every armored car, every command vehicle. Tanaka gestured at the dual receivers visible inside the open chassis. And this model allows them to monitor 2 frequencies simultaneously. They listen to their platoon on one channel while monitoring company or battalion command on another. The implications hung in the air like smoke. Japanese doctrine assumed radios were scarce resources, installed only in command vehicles. Subordinate tanks used receivers, if they had radios at all, to hear orders they would acknowledge through actions rather than words. The rigid hierarchy was built into the equipment itself. The Americans had democratized communication. Every crew could transmit. Every commander could receive information from any source. The network wasn't hierarchical, it was distributed. "The movements we observed," Nakagawa said slowly. "The coordination that seemed supernatural was simply men talking to each other," Tanaka finished. "While we waved flags and shouted through jungle noise, they were discussing tactics across kilometers of battlefield with perfect clarity." He looked at the green metal box with something approaching reverence. The Americans hadn't won with thicker armor or bigger guns. They'd won with something far more fundamental, the ability to share information at the speed of light. "How long would it take us to produce something equivalent?" Nakagawa asked. Major Tanaka consulted his engineering team's preliminary assessment, though he already knew the answer would end any hope of closing this gap. 18 months minimum, assuming we can access FM patents, assuming our industry can manufacture precision crystals at scale. Assuming— He stopped. The list of assumptions was longer than the time Japan had left to fight. They'd discovered the secret, but discovery had come far too late. March 15, 1945. Near Balat Pass, Luzon. Inside his Sherman, Sergeant Mike O'Brien adjusted his headset and keyed the transmit button with practiced ease. "Baker 3 to Baker 1. Got eyes on 2 Type 97s in the tree line. Grid reference 4723. Can you get an angle from your position?" The response came immediately, clear as a bell, despite 300 yards and a ridgeline between them. "Baker 1 confirms. We'll push left. You hold center. Baker 4, can you get Artie on that ridgeline?" Baker 4 to Baker 1, already on it. "Fire mission incoming. 30 seconds. O'Brien smiled. This was how modern war was supposed to work, like a conversation between professionals who trusted each other enough to speak plainly. No formal radio procedure slowing things down. Just crews talking, thinking, adapting together. 30 seconds later, American artillery shrieked overhead with precise timing. The Japanese tanks, caught repositioning, never had a chance to coordinate a response. The same moment, 400 meters away. Corporal Kenji Sato watched the artillery impacts through his Type 97's vision port and felt the familiar knot of helplessness tighten in his chest. His radio headset emitted only static punctuated by fragments of garbled Japanese that might have been orders or might have been atmospheric interference. He couldn't see his platoon leader's tank, The jungle and smoke made visual signals impossible. His signalman had tried waving flags 15 minutes ago. No response came back. They were alone in a battlefield where the enemy seemed capable of seeing everything, knowing everything, coordinating everything. Another American voice crackled through the static on their monitoring frequency, intercepted but useless. The language barrier was the least of their problems. It was the casual confidence, the seamless coordination that demoralized more than any artillery barrage. March 28, 1945. Mike Tila, Burma. Captain James Whitmore's Sherman platoon had been separated from their company for 6 hours, operating independently through broken terrain southwest of the city. It didn't matter. Every 15 minutes he checked in with battalion, coordinated with the British units to his north, and updated the artillery forward observers on enemy positions. All Baker units, this is Baker 1. British forces report Japanese armor moving south on the Rangoon Road. We're going to cut them off at the bridge. Baker 2 and 3 take the eastern approach. 4 and 5 hold the western exit. Artie standing by if we need it. 4 acknowledgements came back within seconds, each crew already moving before the transmission ended. The same engagement, Japanese perspective. Major Ichiro Watanabe's command tank had been the communications hub for his entire company, until an American shell severed his antenna 20 minutes ago. Now he was deaf and mute, watching his platoons scatter without coordination because they couldn't hear his orders and he couldn't hear their reports. His signals officer worked frantically to rig a replacement antenna. It would take an hour. The battle would be decided in minutes. Through his periscope, Watanabe watched American and British tanks converge on his position from multiple directions with timing that suggested they could see through terrain. He knew they couldn't. He knew the secret now. Major Tanaka's report had been distributed to all senior officers. But knowing didn't help. His radio jamming teams had tried transmitting static on American frequencies, but the FM signals cut through interference like it didn't exist. His signals intelligence units could intercept American transmissions perfectly, but understanding English tactical chatter in real time proved impossible. And even when they did understand, Japanese tanks lacked the radios to respond with equivalent speed. Evening, both fronts. In the Philippines and Burma, the pattern repeated with mechanical inevitability. American tanks talked, coordinated, adapted. Japanese tanks waited for orders that came too slowly, or not at all, relied on visual signals the jungle rendered useless, and fought as isolated machines against an enemy that operated as a unified network. The American crews finished their battles and checked in with casual efficiency. All Baker units report status. Baker 2, operational, ammunition at 60%. Baker 3, good to go. Baker 4, we're solid. The Japanese crews finished their battles in silence, surrounded by static, never quite sure if anyone else had survived until morning light made visual confirmation possible, if morning came at all. Courage couldn't overcome clarity. Discipline couldn't defeat distributed command. In the jungle, silence was simply another word for defeat. April 3, 1945. Somewhere in northern Luzon, Private First Class Masaru Honda sat inside his Type 97, hands trembling as he pressed the radio headset against his ear. Static, always static. The hiss had become the soundtrack to his nightmares, a white noise that meant isolation, meant vulnerability, meant the Americans could be anywhere, and his crew would never know until shells started landing. Anything? Lieutenant Fujimoto asked, though they both knew the answer. Masaru shook his head. Their platoon leader's tank had been destroyed 2 hours ago. Since then, silence. They'd seen flashes of movement through the trees that might have been friendly forces or might have been the enemy. No way to know. No way to ask. No way to coordinate. The Americans, meanwhile, never stopped talking. Their intercepted transmissions filled the frequency spectrum with calm, professional voices discussing positions, calling for support, warning each other about threats. Even when Masaru couldn't understand the English words, the tone told him everything: confidence, coordination, control. The static in his own headset told him the opposite. April 8, 1945. 14th Area Army Headquarters, Manila. Colonel Yoshio Nakamura stood before a map covered in red marks, indicating destroyed Japanese tank units. Each mark represented not just metal and machinery, but crews who had fought with courage that doctrine promised would be sufficient. It hadn't been. "The men are afraid of the radios now," Captain Suzuki reported quietly. "Not the American radios, our own. See? They put on the headsets and hear only static, and it reminds them they're alone. Some crews have stopped monitoring frequencies entirely. They say it's worse to hear nothing than to not listen at all." Nakamura understood. He'd read the psychological assessment reports, the interrogation transcripts from captured crews, the after-action analyses that all pointed to the same conclusion. Japanese tank forces were experiencing a morale collapse that had nothing to do with casualties and everything to do with isolation. "The Americans land shells with accuracy that seems supernatural," Suzuki continued. "Our men know it's not supernatural. It's coordination. Their tanks talk to their artillery. Their artillery talks to their forward observers. Their infantry talks to everyone. While we shout across 50 meters and hope someone hears," Nakamura finished. The tactical manuals on his desk suddenly felt like historical artifacts from a previous era of warfare. Sections on flag signals, visual coordination, maintaining rigid command hierarchy, all written by men who had never imagined an enemy where every vehicle could communicate instantaneously across kilometers of chaos. "Courage and discipline," Nakamura said quietly, more to himself than Suzuki. "We were taught these were the foundations of victory. That superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage." "Sir? But spirit cannot overcome silence. Discipline cannot defeat distributed command." He turned from the map, suddenly exhausted. "Our doctrine assumed communication was a scarce resource that flowed downward from commanders to subordinates. The Americans built a doctrine where communication flows in every direction simultaneously. They didn't just give every tank a better radio, they gave every crew a voice." April 12, 1945. Type 97 Chiha, jungle position. Sergeant Takeo Yamada hadn't slept in 36 hours. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the static. That terrible, empty hiss that meant his crew was fighting deaf and blind, while the enemy operated with perfect awareness. His gunner, barely 18 years old, had started flinching at the sound of American radio chatter on intercepted frequencies. Not from fear of what the Americans were saying, from fear of the contrast. Their clarity versus Japanese silence. "Sergeant," the boy whispered during a quiet moment, "are we going to lose?" Yamada wanted to say no, wanted to recite the doctrinal certainties about Japanese warrior spirit, about courage overcoming technology, about discipline defeating decadence. Instead, he put on his headset, heard the static that had become the voice of defeat, and said nothing at all. The silence, it turned out, was answer enough. September 15, 1945. Imperial Japanese Army Technical Research Institute, Tokyo. Major Hiroshi Tanaka, no longer wearing his uniform as the Imperial Army had ceased to exist 13 days ago, sat in a building that had somehow survived the firebombing. Before him lay 3 SCR-508 radio sets, captured at various points during the war. Now the subject of the most important technical analysis Japan would conduct in defeat. The report he was writing would never be classified as military intelligence. There was no military left to receive it. Instead, it would become something more important, a lesson for a nation that would have to rebuild from ashes. Communication superiority, he wrote in careful characters, proved more decisive than armor thickness, gun caliber, or tactical doctrine. The Americans did not win the Pacific Tank War through superior courage. Our crews demonstrated bravery equal to any in history. They won because they transformed armored warfare from individual combat into networked operations. Around him, civilian engineers who had once designed military radios were now studying American FM technology with the intensity of students who had failed a crucial examination. Because that's exactly what they were. The technology gap was substantial but not insurmountable, Tanaka continued. The doctrinal gap was absolute. We treated radios as tools for transmitting orders. The Americans treated them as systems for sharing information. We built hierarchies. They built networks. We valued obedience. They valued initiative enabled by communication. March 1950. Newly formed National Police Reserve, precursor to JSDF. Commander Kenji Sato, the same corporal who had sat in helpless silence in his Type 97 5 years earlier, inspected the American surplus vehicles being prepared for Japan's nascent security forces. Every single vehicle, from jeeps to the few tanks they were permitted, carried radio transceivers as standard equipment. No vehicle operates without communications capability. He instructed the young recruits who hadn't lived through the war. No crew fights alone. The moment you lose radio contact, you retreat to restore it. Communication is not secondary to combat. It is the foundation of combat. One recruit, too young to remember, asked, "Why is this so important, Commander?" Sato paused, remembering jungle silence and American shells landing with impossible precision. "Because I once fought an enemy who could talk to each other while we could not. The bravest men I knew died not from lack of courage, but from lack of connection. That will never happen to Japanese forces again." 1954. Japan Self-Defense Forces Armored Division, Field Manual. The doctrine written by officers who had survived the Pacific War contained principles that would have been revolutionary in 1941. Every vehicle will maintain constant radio communication. Distributed command authority is essential. Information flows in all directions. Network degradation is treated as combat damage requiring immediate response. Communication superiority enables all other tactical advantages. The Type 61 tank, Japan's first post-war main battle tank, would be designed with the radio as integral to its combat effectiveness as the main gun. The engineers who created it had learned from Major Tanaka's reports, from Commander Sato's experiences, from the accumulated wisdom of defeat. Present day. Modern Japanese ground. Self-defense force tanks operate with digital communication systems that would seem like science fiction to the men who fought with Type 97s. Data links share targeting information instantaneously. Network-centric warfare is the foundation of doctrine, not an afterthought. In American armored units, descendants of the same principles first deployed in SCR 508 radios continue to evolve. Digital systems, satellite communications, AI-assisted coordination, all extensions of the simple truth recognized in 1941. Connected forces defeat isolated forces, regardless of individual courage. The lesson learned in the jungles of Leyte and Luzon, paid for in Japanese blood and American innovation, became doctrine for armies worldwide. Modern warfare is not fought by warriors in isolation. It is fought by networks of professionals who understand that information dominates battlefields more decisively than armor or firepower. The Japanese fought with courage. The Americans fought with connection. In the end, silence met speech, and speech won. That 180-pound green metal box, the Motorola SCR 508, quietly changed warfare forever. Not with a dramatic explosion, but with something far more powerful: the simple ability to talk, to coordinate, to think together across the chaos of battle. The tank crews of 1944 could never have imagined today's digital battlefield, but they would recognize its fundamental truth immediately. Those who can communicate, dominate.